Daf Yomi, Tractate Zevachim, page 109b. Last line of 109a, just for context. The Gemara was asking whose opinion is expressed in the Braita. It is the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua as it is taught in the Braita. Rabbi Yehoshua says, with regard to all the offerings that are mentioned in the Torah, from which there remains only an olive bulk of meat, the rest having been destroyed or rendered impure. Now we're on top of 109b, or from which there remains an olive bulk of sacrificial portions, for example, fat, to be burned on the altar, one still sprinkles the blood of the offering on the altar, and thereby fulfills his obligation. Chatzi zayis basol. Second here, excuse me, my little yad. Or from, I'm sorry. Chatzi zayis basar. We're holding by a few words into the first line. Chatzi zayis basar v'chatzi zayis chelev. Eino zayis is a dam oile. Chatzi zayis basar v'chatzi zayis chelev. Zayis is a dam v'nei. Shikulim hanei mincha pidu kula kiyem eslo yizrok. Okay. But if all that remains is half an olive bulk of meat and half an olive bulk of fat, one may not sprinkle the blood, as since the meat and the sacrificial portions are used differently, the former being eaten and the latter being burned on the altar, they cannot combine to form the minimum requirement of an olive bulk. This applies only to offerings whose meat is eaten. But for a burnt offering, even if all that remains is half an olive bulk of flesh and half an olive bulk of fat, one sprinkles the blood, because since the offering is consumed upon the altar in its entirety, all of its parts combined together. Yeah? And with regard to a meal offering, even if in all it still exists, all of it still exists, one does not sprinkle the blood. It is apparent that Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion in this Braita is the one expressed in the Braita. The Gemara clarifies the final clause of the Braita. What is the relevance of a meal offering to the sprinkling of blood? In a meal offering, there is no blood at all. Rav Papa said, the Braita is referring to a meal offering brought with the libations that accompany an animal offering. If the entire body of the offering was destroyed, but the meal offering that accompanied it remains, one might have thought that would be sufficient to allow for the sprinkling of the blood. The Braita teaches that this is incorrect. This concludes the Talmud, and now move on to the Mishnah. Zog de Mishnah koymet velavoyne vekatoyres. Umin chas koyhan, umin chas koy Mashiach, min chas Sochim. Shikri vachas mihen gezayis bechutz chayav. Rabbi Eliezer poteo. Ash yakriv et kulan. Kulan shikri bivnim she'em mihen gezayis. Yikriv bechutz chayav. The Mishnah says, with regard to the handful of a meal offering, the frankincense, the incense, the meal offering of priests, the meal offering of the anointed priests, and the meal offering brought with the libations that accompany animal offerings, in a case where one sacrificed even an olive bulk from any one of these, which should be sacrificed on the altar outside the temple, he is liable, as the burning of an olive bulk is considered proper burning. Rabbi Eliezer deems him exempt unless he sacrifices the whole of any one of these items outside the temple. Rabbi Eliezer concedes that with regard to any of them that one sacrificed inside the courtyard but left over an olive bulk from them and then sacrificed that olive bulk outside the courtyard, he is liable. And with regard to any of these offerings that were lacking any amount, if one sacrifices it outside the courtyard, he is exempt. Hamakriv Chadashim Imo in Machutz Chayav. One who sacrifices sacrificial meat, which is eaten in sacrificial portions, meaning those that are to be burned on the altar outside the courtyard, is liable for the sacrifice of the sacrificial portions, but he is not liable for sacrificing the meat. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, the Talmud. The sages taught in Braita, each morning and afternoon, a pras, meaning a half of a lamb, of incense must be burned in the sanctuary. Nevertheless, one who burns only an olive bulk of incense outside the courtyard is liable. If one burns half a paras inside the temple, he is exempt. The Gemara addresses the latter clause of the Braita. It enters our mind to explain what is meant by he is exempt. It means that a non-priest for whom it is prohibited to perform the sacrificial rites in the temple is exempt if he burns incense inside the temple. The Gemara rejects this. Why should he be exempt? This is an act of sacrificial burning. Even though he has burned less than a pras, it is apparent from the first clause of the Braita that burning even an olive bulk is considered an act of sacrificial burning. I thought an olive bulk was only for food. Okay, anyway. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Chizda, Amar Rabbi Yerem Barabba, Amar Rav Mai Patur Sibo. Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Chizda said that Rabbi Yerem son of Abba said that Rav said. What is meant by he is exempt? It means that if a priest burns half a pras inside the temple, the community is thereby exempt from its obligation to burn incense despite the fact that less than the required amount was burned. Amar Vizera, Ikashili, Akashili, Hadimra, Alo, Baha, Filu, Rabbi Eliezer, Moide, Deha, Rabbi Eliezer, Lavok, Ikoma. Rabbi Zera said, if there is something difficult for me with regard to this Braita, this is difficult for me. That which Rav said concerning this Braita with regard to this halacha, that if a priest burns less than a pras of incense, the community fulfills its obligation. Even Rabbi Eliezer concedes. Rabbi Zera explains, this is difficult for me as Rabbi Eliezer rules in the Mishnah, that one who burns an olive bulk of incense outside is exempt. Effectively, he is saying that burning less than the required amount is not an act of sacrificial burning. How then can he hold that the community fulfills its obligation by burning the burning of less than a pras? Rabbah said, with regard to the burning of incense designated to be burned in the sanctuary upon the golden altar, everyone, meaning the rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer, agree that everyone agrees that the Torah does not specify the amount to be burned. The requirement to burn a pras is rabbinic. Accordingly, the obligation is fulfilled even if only an olive bulk of incense is burned there, as the Braita states, and one who burns an olive bulk of that incense outside the temple is liable. Kipligi. When they disagree in the Mishnah of Aktorah Bifnim, when they disagree in the Mishnah, it is with regard to the burning of incense in the inner sanctum. In other words, in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. There's the sanctum and the inner sanctum. The inner sanctum is the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. Concerning that obligation, the verse states, and he shall take his handful of sweet incense, beaten small, and bring it within the curtain. Leviticus 16:12. As one sage, Rabbi Eliezer holds that his handful indicates that specifically that measure must be burned in order to fulfill the obligation. Accordingly, he also holds that one who burns only an olive bulk of that incense outside the courtyard is exempt. And the other sage, the rabbis, who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, holds that his handful does not indicate that specifically that measure must be burned. and the obligation can be fulfilled even with a lesser amount. Accordingly, they also hold that one who burns even an olive bulk of that incense outside the courtyard is liable. Amalei Abaye, v'ho kiko kesiva chuka, v'aktava b'fnim, huketi. Abaye said to Rabbah, but when the term statute is written with regard to the Yom Kippur temple service, see Leviticus 16:29, it is also written with regard to the burning of incense in the inner sanctum. The term statute stated with regard to a rite indicates that it is valid only if performed precisely in accordance with all the details mentioned in the Torah concerning it. Accordingly, the term his handful must be specific. Rather, Abaye said, with regard to the burning of incense in the inner sanctum, meaning in the Holy of Holies, on Yom Kippur, everyone agrees that the obligation is only fulfilled if a handful of incense is burned. Also, everyone agrees with regard to burning incense in the sanctuary that the obligation is fulfilled even with an olive bulk, as the Bride states, and one who burns an olive bulk of incense outside the temple is liable. Keep ligi v'haktorah lechutz ma'os v'yalfinu pinim michutz u'manos v'lo yalfinu. When they disagree in the Mishnah, it is with regard to the burning of incense of the Holy of Holies outside the temple courtyard. One sage, the rabbis, holds that we derive the measure for liability for incense of the inner sanctum from the incense of the outer sanctum, meaning the sanctuary. Just as for the latter one is liable for an olive bulk, so too for the former one is liable for an olive bulk. And the other sage, Rabbi Eliezer, holds that we do not derive one from the other. Rather, since the obligation inside the Holy of Holies is fulfilled only with a handful of incense, one is liable for burning that incense outside the temple only if he burns that amount. Rava said, in rejection of Abaye's understanding, now, if the rabbis do not derive the measure for liability for offering up outside the temple courtyard, with regard to other rites performed in the outer sanctum, from incense of the outer sanctum, is it necessary to question whether they would derive the measure for liability for incense of the inner sanctum from incense of the outer sanctum? Certainly they would not. Mahi, the time Mahi. The Gemara asks, what is the right that Rava is referring to in his response to Abaye? The Tanya Yachol Hamal B'chas B'Gazayas Kavetz B'chas B'Gazayas Emorin Yamanase B'chas B'Shlosh L'Gihayim B'chas B'Shlosh L'Gihayim Hechayim Tamadoma Ta'asos Ala Shalem Chayim Eno Chayav Ala Chasel. The Gemara asks, what is the right that Rava is referring to in his response to Abaye? It is, as it is taught in the rights that one might have thought, that one who offers up outside the courtyard less than an olive bulk of the handful taken from a meal offering, or less than an olive bulk of the sacrificial portions, or one who pours as a libation outside the courtyard less than 3 log of wine, or who pours as a libation on Sukkot less than 3 log of water, that he would be liable. To counter this, the verse states, and he will not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice it. Leviticus 17, verse 9. The term to sacrifice it indicates that one is liable for the sacrifice of a complete offering outside the courtyard, but one is not liable for the sacrifice of an incomplete offering outside. The Gemara explains Rava's inference, but the Braita states that for a libation of less than 3 log outside the courtyard, one is exempt despite the fact that the libation still contains a few olive bulks. And it is apparent then that the rabbis who do not derive the measure for liability for the rite of libation that should be performed in the outer sanctum from the incense that should be burned in the outer sanctum, certainly then they would not derive the measure for liability for incense of the inner sanctum from the incense of the outer sanctum. Rather, Rava said, to resolve Rabbi Zera's difficulty, Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis agree with regard to the incense of the sanctuary that the Torah does not specify an amount to be burned, and the community fulfills its obligation even if only an olive bulk is burned, as is taught in the Braita. When they disagree in the Mishnah, it is in a case where, for example, one designated to have pras, portions of incense, in accordance with the rabbinic requirement to burn one pras. To be continued.